What is up, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of Bitcoin and Markets. Thank you for joining me today. I'm just going to do a quick live stream. We're going to read over an article that I put out. It's a reaction to Jack Mallers and Peter Schiff's epic gold and Bitcoin debate. Then go over a tweet that I put out about peak cheap oil versus peak oil demand. Talk about some of those concepts. So let's jump right into it. Let me make sure I have the proper tab pulled up. And let's share this. So bitcoinandmarkets.com, that's where you find all of my content. This one went out today, Bitcoin Minute, rethinking the Bitcoin versus gold debate. And right before I jump into this, guys, I am live streaming on YouTube, Rumble, Twitter, and Telegram. If you're watching on Twitter, appreciate you guys going over to YouTube and Rumble. Like, comment, subscribe over there. Tell me where I get it wrong, where I get it right in the comments. And join the community at Telegram because we go back and forth all day talking about all sorts of different news stuff. But okay, let's jump into this. So you probably saw a bunch of the clips here. We're going to watch two clips, not the full thing, but I do link to the original video here on the website. This is a free tier. I'm putting out a lot of free content, so jump over there and subscribe on bitcoinmarkets.com. Okay, so Jack Mallers and Peter Schiff debated Bitcoin versus gold on David Lin's YouTube show. Clips of Mallers' takedown of Schiff and Schiff's tired arguments are all over X today. I thought I'd give my written response to both and follow it up with a short live stream. Okay, so that's what I'm doing now. We first talk about Schiff's old debunked, this is misspelled, debunked talking points, and I break these down. So let's just watch this clip. I hope it comes through okay on the audio, and let's go.
Yeah. Bitcoin is scarce in the sense that there's 21 million of them. But so what? It's just a string of numbers. There's nothing to look at. You know, there's nothing that it does that's any different than all the other strings of numbers of all the other cryptocurrencies. In fact, there's 22.1 quadrillion Satoshis. I mean, there's enough Satoshis for everybody to have hundreds of thousands of them. You can't do anything more with a Bitcoin than you can with a Satoshi, which is nothing. And I never said that something has to be tangible to have value. Intangible assets, software is valuable, music, all kinds of things that you can't physically touch have value because of the things that they can do and the benefits that I derive from using them. But that is not true about Bitcoin. The only benefit people hope to derive from Bitcoin is getting rich when it goes to the moon. And in order for that to happen, more people have to be foolish enough to buy it. You know, and that's all it is. It's just an exercise in the greater fool. And yes, so far, the price is still, what, 56,000 or something like that. And people made money. But I think more people who own Bitcoin now have lost money than made money as far as the numbers. Because I think a lot of the money came in at the top. And so they're losing money. And the next big crash that's coming, and I think there is a big crash coming, especially when we get a lot of liquidations out of the ETFs. I think that's still coming. I don't think the people in the ETFs are dyed-in-the-wool hodlers. You know, they're traders. You know, and they're gonna take their losses and move on. And I think there's going to be a massive crash in Bitcoin when that happens. Whether that's the ultimate bottom, I don't know. Maybe there'll be a bounce. But I think Bitcoin is going to go below 20,000, probably below 10,000 when you get this big liquidation. And then almost everybody who owns Bitcoin will be down. And yes, you'll be able to make the argument that had you bought it in 2010 and 2011 or 12, you're still way ahead. But that doesn't do any good to the people who bought it in 2020, 2021, 2022, 2023, who bought it with real money. You know, most people who bought Bitcoin, back then, bought it with play money. People weren't putting their retirement savings into Bitcoin when it first showed up. But you have a lot of that's happened now. So a lot more money has been invested at much higher prices than what was invested, in the early years when the price was much lower.
Yeah. Okay. So I think Jack Mallers is just the man when it comes to sitting there respectfully listening, not jumping in, on Peter Schiff. Just want to make sure that I'm going out here on all these platforms. Yeah, looks good. Okay. All right. So I break down his different points because he smashes together a lot of these common tropes that we hear about Bitcoin. And if I write these down and then talk about them here on a live stream, you guys will have a reference point to come back. Now, I'm not saying that this is the end all be all of what you can say. Jack Mallers did a great job responding to a lot of the points, of course. And so this is just my reaction to give you guys something where you can bookmark it and have it at the ready if you need to. So his first comment here is about Bitcoin is not scarce because there are infinite numbers of tokens. So my response is try sending other tokens to settle a Bitcoin transaction. You can't even, like, this was one of the arguments with Bitcoin Cash as well. Bitcoin Cash was a heyday for all of these people talking about infinite number of tokens because you can just fork Bitcoin consistently, right? And come up with an infinite number of forks. But if you try to send a fork to another fork, they don't settle. So obviously they're different assets. They're cryptographically and mathematically non-fungible. It's impossible to send Ethereum to a Bitcoin address and settle. Okay, it's impossible. Bitcoin offers near perfect confidence against counterfeits, unlike gold, which can be gold-plated tungsten, fool's gold, or various carats. So imagine you wanting 24 karat gold, which is half, right? Or 12 is half. But I think 12 and 14 karat are common amounts. Maybe 14 is half because 28 is full, whatever. But yeah, imagine getting a few carats wrong. Or you can get completely different counterfeit, or you can get gold-plated tungsten. I mean, there's reports all the time of these gold bars being found. And so, gold does not have this protection against counterfeits the same way that Bitcoin does. You cannot settle counterfeit Bitcoin, period. So all of these infinite number of tokens do not count because they cannot settle a Bitcoin transaction. There will only ever be 21 million Bitcoins. You can't pass off tokens as counterfeits. This argument is like saying the supply. So Peter Schiff's argument is like saying the supply of gold isn't limited because there's silver, copper, nickel, tungsten, etc. Any idiot can see those things are not the same. Yet Peter tries to make this claim about Bitcoin. Okay, his second claim is Bitcoin does nothing. It is just a string of numbers. Well, that's kind of true. I'm not going to debate that specific thing. And Mallers did not debate that either. Pretty much we take as an assumption that doesn't matter, that it's a string of numbers, because that's what money is supposed to be. Money is an indirect good, demanded not for itself, but for what it can be exchanged for in the future. So Bitcoin does nothing? Yes, it does. It settles $40 billion worth of transactions every day on the Bitcoin blockchain, on the Bitcoin network. So it does do something. It does settlement. Okay. But it is an indirect good, which you don't want for the demand itself. You want it to exchange for goods and services in the future. Money is not meant to be consumed during use, as that would make it a poor store of value. Any utility value of money, like gold in jewelry and dentistry, distorts prices in the modern economy. Okay, so this is a little bit more dense of a comment here. Utility value, you can also call that the value that's not monetary premium. So once a good like gold is starting to be used as money, there is a separate profile of demand. So some people will demand gold for jewelry, some for dentistry, and some for money. There's multiple sources of demand, but that value, the overall market value, is a combination of all different types of demand for that good. So a utility value that's not a strict monetary value, monetary premium, it distorts prices because utility for purposes other than money distorts pure supply and demand for its role as money. If it has many different roles, the role as money is diminished. Okay. It's not 100% money. It's only 95% money and 5% jewelry and 5% dentistry, whatever, you know? So, that's not good. It's not good to say gold has extra utility value. It's only good when you're coming from a non-money economy. So if you go back in Austrian thinking with Menger and stuff, you have the most saleable good, and that it appears through the regression theorem. So what gave money its current value is yesterday's value, and yesterday's value got this value from the day before that, and you regress all the way till before it was used as a function of money. You used it just as its utility value. Okay. And so that utility value is important for bootstrapping a currency, but not for actual currency when it's being used in a modern economy. Bitcoin bootstrapped off of the dollar. The dollar bootstrapped off of gold. So there, you can bootstrap off of previous regressions, because you can just think of this like the dollar. What's the value of the dollar? Well, the value of what it was yesterday and the value of what it was the day before that. And eventually you get back to saying $35 an ounce, right? So they bootstrapped the value of the dollar off of the regression of gold, and they bootstrapped the value of Bitcoin off of the value of the dollar. The regression theorem works for Bitcoin as well. You just bootstrap it. Okay, so Bitcoin is a string of numbers within the context of a network. You cannot separate the two conceptually. They are one. That string of numbers is weight on the network. So, like if you say, what's the atomic weight of gold? What is it? Is it, damn, I should know this. Is it 46? Oh my gosh, atomic weight of gold. Oh man. Okay. It's 79 on a periodic table. So 79 is the atomic number for gold, and Bitcoin has kind of an atomic weight or a weight of measurement on the network. This is what you use to measure it versus protons in the nucleus. You use the weight on the blockchain. Okay, next point that he made is the old 21 quadrillion Satoshis argument. I don't need to address that much. Divisibility is a benefit for a currency, allowing for finer pricing. The more easily divided and verified, the lower the transaction costs, system-wide use costs. So, but by transaction costs here, I don't mean like the cost to send a transaction. I mean like kind of like the overhead of the entire economy, or the overhead of the entire monetary system, maybe you could say. In a gold-based system, it's going to be minting of the coins, and keeping maybe different denominations of those coins, and also like if you just have gold coins can't be used for very many transactions because you'd have to have a tiny little amount of gold. So then you have to use either other metals or certificates, bills, and so the divisibility of gold is also a hindrance in that way, and increases the entire overhead of the monetary system. But Bitcoin doesn't have that because it's super easily divisible and verifiable right there. I mean, just think if you had all these different denominations of coins and then someone starts having this counterfeit operation to just counterfeit one specific coin or something like that. So you have to check all these coins, all the different denominations of the coins. You have to melt them down and remint them, etc. And so that's a lot of overhead to the monetary system, where Bitcoin does not have that, yet it has even greater divisibility. So you've maximized the divisibility, maybe not maximized, but you've made the divisibility much greater, while also bringing the costs of verification down, which is very, very important. You don't increase the supply by cutting something into smaller pieces. That's a quick way to sound unintelligent. All right, next topic he kind of smushes in here is things have value for the things that they can do and the benefits you derive from using them. That's a direct quote from that video. This contradicts Schiff's own intrinsic value argument. He claims value is inherent in the good itself. Of course, there is no such thing as intrinsic value. Value is based on supply and demand. Okay, next one is another quote. The only benefit someone hopes to get from Bitcoin is getting rich when it goes to the moon. Obviously, a straw man. While there is speculative interest in Bitcoin, and no one will debate that that is true. Why? Because that exists in all asset purchase decisions. I mean, unless you're purchasing food to eat it right away, or you're buying a consumption good to consume it right away, any sort of investment asset, you are speculating on the value of that asset, right? If you buy gold to hold it, which I'm sure Peter would recommend, you're speculating on the future value of the gold. So yes, there is speculative interest in Bitcoin, and that's not a dig. That it means that it's a typical asset. But there are also arguments for the benefit of Bitcoin as sound money, and Peter should know these because they are the same as for gold. Bitcoin is better gold, and the reasons people stubbornly hold on to gold are the same reasons they hold Bitcoin. He essentially is arguing against himself here. He might say, but gold has utility value, and we just covered that above, but that's not a reason to hold it as a store of value. So if something has utility value, yeah, you're using it. That's not a reason to hold it. So it doesn't answer this fundamental mismatch of questions. Okay, next thing that Peter talks about here is more people who own Bitcoin now have lost money than made money. Well, we can check this empirically thanks to the technology of the blockchain in realized price. So that is the market price of each UTXO the last time it was transacted. That serves as the basis value for all Bitcoin, and that's currently around $31,000. So we know taking all the UTXOs, finding out their basis value comes out to 31,000. So people have almost doubled their money on average. The UTXOs have doubled their money on average. So he's empirically wrong about this. And his last few points of venomous attacks, price predictions and so forth, we don't need to cover that. Okay, let's get into Jack Mallers' kind of response to this. And then we'll go into a few points of disagreement that I do have with him. I really like Jack Mallers. When I remember when he first came on the scene, he was really young. I don't know if he was 18 or what, but this was years and years ago before Strike. And he was just always like a well-spoken, outgoing personality that we needed in Bitcoin. And he's still that way. He's a young man now, but he has a successful company. He has very based takes on Bitcoin. And so, yeah, I think overall, I really appreciate all that Jack does. Peter Schiff, on the other hand, I think that he is a straight up con man. He's been around here for as long as I have in Bitcoin, 10, 11 years, maybe more. And he knows these arguments. I mean, his son was a Bitcoiner for many years. He knows these arguments. He's just lying. He's talking in bad faith and trying to sell gold at the same time. So it's not just that he's in bad faith. It's also that he's a salesman trying to sell you something that, invest in his Europack fund that has lost money when you could have been, bought and hold Bitcoin for the last 10 years and gone 500x on your money. So I think Peter Schiff is a bad actor. Anyway, so let's play this and then we'll get into my comment.
David, the real problem with gold is that unfortunately it has to centralize. The problem is that gold can't achieve transaction finality without the help of a government or a central party, meaning that when gold was operating in a local economy and you can exchange the physical coins with your direct counterpart for your butcher, your local tailor, your grocer, whoever you were exchanging with, gold was great. When the world needed to scale an economy and the velocity of money larger than your local economy, gold failed us. Gold failed us because gold is just a bare physical metal. It does not carry a monetary network. What's the gold network? The gold network are human beings. And when you're trying to transact in an economy of billions of people globally, you are reliant on central parties, banks, governments. And it was for that reason that gold failed. And it failed in a way that you can't operate a truly free market when the concentrated supply is with those that you have to trust. And so that's fundamentally what Bitcoin solved, is that you are able to create a scarce bearer instrument and a network that can achieve finality in transactional settlement without the reliance on any government or central party.
All right. So very good take there. I mean, the way he says things is so smooth and so convincing. He's really a good spokesman for Bitcoin. So I'm glad that he's out there. Before we get into my comments on his stuff, let's go and take a look at the comments down below here on YouTube from John Delaney. What's going on? Did you hear Yellow's vid on Nostr? No, I did not. Obviously, that was today, but I did not hear that. Let me know, if you have any main points that you want me to respond to from that. Dex Invictus back with us. What's up? And I did not see any on Telegram. So let's jump into my thoughts here on Jack Mallers. And his first thing he said here is the real problem with gold, unfortunately, it has to centralize. Okay, that is a bold claim, in my opinion. So I say no. That's it doesn't have to centralize. He's talking about scaling from a simple local economy to a global economy. It has to centralize, but that's not necessarily the case. So scaling alone is not enough to pressure gold into centralization. Gold can scale to a global peer-to-peer network, as it did for hundreds of years. So it functioned fine. Well, relatively fine. For hundreds of years, if not thousands. I mean, there was a massive period where, people are on a silver standard, gold standard, back to a bimetallic standard, to a silver standard, to a gold standard. I mean, it functioned for many, many hundreds of years as a global network. You could go anywhere on the planet and spend your gold or silver coins, especially if they were Spanish dollars. I mean, that it was a global network, and it has to be peer-to-peer because you do hand those physically off to other people. So gold can scale to a peer-to-peer network, but the problem is that such a system would only be minimally complex. So it leads to mercantilism and other economic patterns that we see in the past. Okay, so money, in this sense here, money is kind of the properties of a certain money define what can happen economically. And so, gold can scale to a global peer-to-peer network, but it can only enable a very simple economy. So I say everyone in the world recognize and use silver and gold for millennia, arguably more universally than the US dollar today. So again, I could use a silver coin in pretty much any place in the world. And then today, I can't necessarily spend $1 on the street anywhere. Most places I probably can find at least somebody to accept my dollars on the street, but it's not universally accepted like gold and silver were universally accepted. So it can scale even more than the dollar. Empirically, this is the evidence that we have. But the type of economy it fostered was agrarian and subsistence-based. So a gold economy or silver economy, a sound money economy, is going to be more agrarian and subsistence-based. That is what the evidence shows for us. And this is one reason why I say, a Bitcoin future is not this utopian, high productivity, digital future that everyone kind of has this idea of Bitcoin is going to fix all these things. No, sound money typically does not foster all of this stuff. So it fosters a very, very slow growing economy, much less trust based, individual to individual, even individual to crown, or individual crown to crown, nation to nation. All that trust is lower, and we'll talk about that here down below. This is a key point that needs to be discussed regarding Bitcoin if we want to make successful predictions about future adoption. So gold didn't fail because of a lack of scale or even its tail emission. There's more gold being dug out of the ground every year. It failed because it was, before I do that, what's gold's tail emission, guys? 1% to 2%. It's not a coincidence that the Fed's target is 2%. That's the high end of the gold tail emission. Okay, so gold standard would have probably a 2% inflation rate as well. So it failed because it was too inelastic for the specific circumstances of the time. This was time dependent. It was situation dependent. That's why gold failed. Gold didn't fail because of any particular universally applicable property. It failed because of the time and the place and its properties. Elastic credit-based money allowed for the outrageous growth of the last 75 years. And this is also empirically, you can't really argue with this. Everything is hockey sticked in the last 75 years. And that coincided with this hyper-elastic credit-based money. So what happens when we don't have hyper-elastic credit-based money, or the credit bubble pops? I mean, just look at the not the demographics, but the population of the world over this last 75 years. It's gone vertical, right? And now it's coming down. So that's like a bubble that's popping. Those circumstances are changing rapidly. And the downside of elasticity, namely shortages at the end of bubbles, and by shortages here, I mean actual monetary shortages, dollar shortage. That's why the dollar keeps going up, not down, versus other currencies. That's why interest rates go down at the end of giant credit bubbles, because there's a shortage for monetary value at the end of credit bubbles. And that will push people towards an inelastic money. So they will be searching for monetary value somewhere. Bitcoin is this new thing. It doesn't have the ability to deflate, right? It's fixed, and it's slightly inflationary right now for the next little while. It's slightly inflationary. It's not deflation. It doesn't have deflation like the credit-based system will be racked by. And so it will naturally push people toward that. The world would revert to gold if it weren't for Bitcoin. So if at the end of this era, at the end of the 75-year credit bubble, let's say Satoshi never existed, Bitcoin never existed, am I to believe that we just continue on this crazy credit system that's not functioning properly? No, we'd go back to gold. We'd go back to a sound money, away from credit money to actual commodity money. And that would be gold if it weren't for Bitcoin. Bitcoin is simply a superior form of sound money compared to gold. Okay, number two, that's the first part. Number two here for the Jack Mallers response. Gold requires trust. That's why it failed. All right. Well, what he means, trust in centralized party. It needs a trusted third party. It needs a network of trusted third parties enabled to function. That's not really true. That's dependent on the complexity of the network. Okay. So again, if you go back to an agrarian subsistence level of a global economy, you don't need this, a bunch of networks of trusted third parties. You're going to be carrying around your own stuff, or none at all. Okay, so just so happens that the period of greatest trust in the international system, when global buy-in to the UN, WTO, IMF, BIS, World Court, human rights, the revised Geneva Conventions, amongst other things, occurred, was the very same period when gold went out of use. Okay, so I'm trying to draw this dichotomy that the greatest trust in the international system was when gold failed. But if gold requires trust, how do we mix those together? I mean, we're kind of mixing up the word trust here, like trusted third party versus international trust or trust within the system, but it's very, very related. Okay, so the period of greatest trust was the period when gold failed. That's kind of counter to what Jack is saying here. In a way, Mahler's argument is backwards. Gold and sound money work best in periods of low trust. So when we have a period of low trust, not just between you and the banker or whatever, but business people, neighbors, internationally, there's a period of lower trust out there in the market. People are going to be less apt to go towards credit-based money. They're going to choose commodity money that doesn't require as much trust. So gold and sound money, commodity money, Bitcoin, they are better in low trust environments. Okay. In such times, the public prefers sound money, even if governments may seek credit to fund wars. But that's another topic, because governments, they can print money or they can borrow money, but they're seeking credit. So that is kind of off topic for this. However, in high trust periods, demand for credit increases, businesses booming, the inelasticity of sound money falls out of favor. If you can inflate, you will inflate. And inflation actually has some benefits. I mean, that's kind of heresy to say. But, if you borrow money and you create a bunch of productivity out of it, a bunch of wealth, is that good or bad? Well, it's good if it's competitive. So, yes, eventually it will roll back on itself. It'll become malinvestment towards the end of the bubble. And that's what we're dealing with right now, the end of a 75-year credit bubble. But in the meantime, you're going to outcompete people. So you are going to get ahead. Your country even is going to get ahead relative to rivals, relative to maybe people that, in your view, have immoral social, cultural practices. So if you are in that situation, you're going to want to have thriving credit so that you can outgrow your rivals, right? So yeah, there are some good things and some bad things to this. But okay, so in the distant future, when the economy is booming and trust is widespread again, long distant future, Bitcoin may lose out to more elastic forms of money. So money that can expand in supply more easily. This is kind of what Jeff Schneider wants or thinks is necessary. That's not necessary, because we're not going into a booming time. We're going into a declining time over the next couple centuries. So there you go. Perhaps a layer 2 derivative followed by a complete unmooring, similar to what happened to gold. So if we do go on a gold standard or a Bitcoin standard, then how do we go off of a Bitcoin standard when we get booming times next time? Well, probably some sort of layer 2, or they just will go complete cold turkey and go off Bitcoin. But like I talked about at the very beginning, regression theorem, you can bootstrap the dollar off of gold and Bitcoin off the dollar. Okay. Well, you have to bootstrap your money off of something. So even if it's a fiat currency or what you consider a fiat currency, you have to bootstrap it off of something. But this process of demonetization of gold will happen the same way it happened to gold. But that's many, many years in the future. I'm talking 200 years or more in the future. So it's not hard to imagine. However, such periods of high trust, low debt saturation, and technological productivity are rare in human history. So this is the formula to get off of Bitcoin in the future, down the road, in this distant future. You have to have high trust, so forming international institutions, having a common kind of cultural view of the future going forward, just cultural belief system, very high trust internationally, not just locally, but internationally as well. You have to have high trust, low debt saturation, because you're going to be using credit to expand. Well, you can't use that if you're at the end of the credit bubble. You have to use that at the beginning of the credit bubble. So we have to have low debt saturation and technological productivity. So you have to have fundamental breakthroughs like learning about electricity, computers, nuclear energy, internal combustion, all those types of things added together, made for this technological advance in the 20th century that enabled this to happen. So anyway, that's the recipe: high trust, low debt saturation, and technological productivity. Okay, so conclusion. Peter Schiff continues to rehash these. Jack Mallers has some strong defense, but I pointed out a few things about that. ultimately, Bitcoin is superior sound money for a period of declining economic vibrancy and growth. And I understand that my picture of Bitcoin and the future, not specifically Bitcoin, but the future in general with Bitcoin, is not like rosy for people, but this is what's going to happen. Okay. And I'm going to tie this into the next topic that I wanted to bring up, and that is kind of back and forth I had with Luke Gromen. So if you know Luke Gromen, you know he's been on this peak cheap oil for a while, and I talk about peak oil demand. And he's gone on podcasts and mocked peak oil demand, laughing, saying specifically, he said that when he hears that, he laughs out loud. So, I just pinged him today and said, hey, this doesn't look like peak cheap oil. We keep diving here. What's the deal? And he said, okay, here you go. Production in 3 of 4 biggest U.S. shale basins are less than 2019. I've seen numbers that are totally contradict this, and the flat at the Permian, and all 4 are in aggregate declining at 600K barrels per day per month at the moment. Okay, this is complete lie, because we would be at close to zero within like 12 months. Okay, that would be 6 million barrels per day. And shale is, I don't know, maybe between 6 and 10 million barrels a day, probably right around the middle of that range. So we would be at zero in a year if this is true. And so it's not. The only numbers that I've seen, and you can look this up, that the Permian continues to grow. I did have a tweet about this, didn't I? Let's see if I can find it real quick. This would be just a couple days ago. Let's see. I know I shared it onto Telegram. Sorry, guys. Let me just look for this. Okay, well, here is an image of this that I created here. This is the 4-week average of, oh, that's gas. That's gasoline. We're talking about oil. Crude oil production in the United States. You can see the U.S. is just continuing to rise. I know I have that image somewhere. I don't want to waste all your guys' time on this. Let me go here real quick and look up this most recent oil post that I have. Sorry. 288 people watching. What's up, guys? Go from Twitter, probably jump over to YouTube and Rumble, like, comment, subscribe. I appreciate that. I appreciate you guys doing that so I can reach more people. Okay, here we go. Macro minute. Oil prices plunge. This came out last week and went through the oil chart, and you can see here. So this is the most recent data from the Energy Information Agency, and you can see the Permian continues to grow, and the rest of the lower 48 here for crude oil is not really declining. So we're continuing to go up, and their forecast is to hit 14 million barrels per day by the end of 2025, roughly. All right, and this isn't even talking about ANWR. It's not talking about what's going to happen when Trump gets in and opens up the pipelines and takes off all the regulations and all that stuff. So it's just ridiculous in my mind to use the argument that the oil production is declining. It's not. It is empirically not declining. And by saying here that it is, what's the source of this data here? Oh, his own newsletter. Okay, that's not correct. The U.S. shale has been approximately 90% of global oil production growth in the past decade? Well, that's because everyone's cutting oil, Luke. Everyone is cutting oil. Look at OPEC. They're almost 6 million barrels per day in production cuts. Now they're rolling back about 2 million barrels per day. That's one of the reasons why the price of oil is dropping. But if we opened up all the excess capacity or all the normal capacity of OPEC and took off regulations in the United States, we would probably have 7 million more barrels of oil a day within the next 6 months. We are in an oil glut. We just don't kind of feel the oil glut because of all these artificial reductions in supply. But if you think about supply and demand, right? If we upped supply, what would happen to the price? It would go down. So he's talking about pricing going up. Prices going up. That's where peak cheap oil is. He's saying prices going up because the cost to get oil out of the ground is continuing to rise. And that is empirically false. Prices are falling. So then I responded. So, he's trying to use a production argument here as his argument for, instead of peak cheap oil, he's using a production argument. And so I say it's not peak oil production. That is his argument. He's talking about cheap. And so I say production can go down and prices can still fall. If demand at, say, any given level, demand is falling and supply is falling slower, you still are going to have prices declining. Okay. So he's talking about peak cheap oil, but all we see is it keeps getting cheaper. Okay. So then he responded, let's see. I think he responded to a couple of these here. Okay. So Florida Bitcoin said, roads are empty, sir. I watched Beach Boulevard, blah, blah, blah. It's starting to look deserted. And I say that's much in line with my peak oil demand theory, not Luke's peak cheap oil. And he fires back. He says China's per capita consumption is 1/5 of the U.S. India's is 1/5 of the U.S. In China plus India is 35% of global population. The population has nothing to do with it. I don't care what people's hopes and dreams are. I care what they can buy. They cannot buy it at that price. Yes, their demand, like if the price of oil was to drop in half, the price is dropping not because of like efficiency gains and stuff like that. He brings up Jevons paradox here later, but it's not dropping because of efficiency gains and all this stuff. It's dropping because of lack of demand. So if price drops, you will only stem the loss of demand. So, okay, let's say the world demands 100 million barrels a day at $70 a barrel. Okay. The demand falls to 99 million barrels per day. And the price then falls to 65. It won't fall to 60 or 50, and then you automatically demand 102 million barrels again. No, the price will fall until it equalizes back with demand. It will fall to a lower demand. Okay? And yeah, so what my peak cheap oil or my peak oil demand is all about, at any given level, price level, we can't have higher demand because there's going to be no growth. So let's say we have a static supply versus demand. And in the world, in the kind of model, the legacy model of the last 75 years, you would have like maybe a 1%, 2% increase in the actual demand for oil. So demand keeps rising. And then production would rise maybe to keep in line with that, or maybe it wouldn't, and the price of oil would go higher or whatever. What I'm saying is that at any given level, that demand is going to fall from here into the foreseeable future because of demographics, because of global recession and deglobalization. So yeah, there could be spikes, okay, here and there. One year might be a higher year than the next year or the last year, whatever. But it is temporary. The overall trajectory of the system is towards lower demand overall. So he says believing in peak oil demand requires believing in no economic progress ever again by 7.4 billion people, not in the US or the EU. In my opinion, that's folly. Okay. Well, not necessarily. Okay. So if here's an example. So I, as an American, I don't know how many barrels of oil that I quote unquote demand every day. Let's say it's 1 barrel of oil every day that I use for per capita here in the United States. Somebody in India, they are using 1/5, okay, per capita. So if you have if they want to double their demand at a certain price, they have to double the ability to buy energy. It's still, and you have a shrinking supply population in other parts of the world, like Germany, say, or Japan, or the United States, whatever. You have a shrinking population. You are going to lose 5 people's worth of demand in India. So it doesn't really, I mean, to believe that the growth of Indian demand can outpace the decline. So you think that he thinks that they will be able to increase their demand while the world is deglobalizing, while the world is going into recession, while we're at the end of this gigantic credit bubble, yet somehow China and India's demand for oil is going to quadruple while everything else is ceteris paribus. There is no demand drop off from other places. Of course, there's going to be demand drop off of other places. Japan's losing 1 million people a year. South Korea's going to be losing much higher percentage very soon. So is China, by the way. And India is below replacement. So population is going to be shrinking everywhere. So they have to double their demand while the global economy is declining. Does that make any sense? No, it does not make any sense. It's not folly. It's just legit. That's the way it's going to be. I responded here. So I say that's because you're strawmanning the theory. It is peak oil demand at a given price. The market cannot sustain higher oil prices because as the price rises, that's his one-sided thesis, price will rise, peak cheap oil, demand falls off. So as price rises, demand falls off. There is simply not enough demand at higher prices for your peak cheap oil. It doesn't matter the populations of countries if they cannot afford to buy more oil. Their demand is infinite at a zero price, but that is missing the basic supply and demand economics. So there is no such thing as a zero price. Okay. And yes, demand is infinite, but as soon as you get 1 penny on that price, then you get a ton less demand. I mean, zero price and infinity, they're both kind of imaginary things. They don't really exist. They're conceptual in theory, not in practice. So he's basing his refutation of peak oil demand on a zero price and infinite demand. Anyway, then I say one more thing, and then I'll check out the comments. Lastly, population in developed countries like Japan, South Korea, China, Germany, Italy, etc., are shrinking, and the global economy along with it. It's not rocket science that if population is shrinking along with the economy going into recession, the oil demand at a given price will fall. The demand curve is shifting left. Oh, and then I did have one more. Let me try to find my other one here. So then this guy, who is this? Grundle Mather, the Grundle of Mather. He said they're overproducing corn to manipulate the price via ethanol. I say, okay, that could be a factor as well, along with EVs, solar, wind, etc. But the main point remains the ability for the market to support higher prices in oil is not there. Demand cannot bid supply for the foreseeable future, outbid supply for the foreseeable future, minus temporary disruptions. Okay, then he responds, what is this? Depends on the currency. Oil keeps getting cheaper in gold and Bitcoin. Oil has to keep getting more expensive in USD since shale prices in USD, not gold. Okay, but shale is getting cheaper. I mean, yes, we've had maybe a couple years of slightly higher shale break-evens, but there's been a lot higher regulation burden in that time. Shale break-evens in a less hampered market would be falling, or else supplies will fall quickly. But okay, that doesn't really say anything to my argument. Let's see. I did have another one. Let's go to replies, because this was about Jevons paradox, and I wanted to talk about that. Okay, so here he goes. Demand for energy is infinite. No, it's not. Infinite is kind of imaginary. Like I said, demand for energy cannot be infinite. Nothing is infinite. I mean, the ideas are infinite, but demand for energy is not an idea. It's like real world. What's the demand for oil at a certain price? If price got cheap enough, I would fly to the Gulfstream, blah, blah, blah. No, you wouldn't, because there's all sorts of other costs involved with flying a Gulfstream, like maintenance, etc. Right? Jevons paradox makes it folly to call for peak oil demand. So, still he is laughing at this. But I say that's because you misunderstand Jevons, and he just did respond to me. So here we go. You misunderstand Jevons. Jevons paradox is about an increase in efficiency, lowering the price, leading to more consumption. So in that case, a static demand curve. If you think about supply and demand, so what they're talking about is the price lowering. And, demand goes up with a lower price. As long as that demand curve is static, price goes down, you demand more. But what we're dealing with here is not a static demand curve. We're dealing with a shift in the demand curve, a shift leftward in demand. That's what we're dealing with here. So he responded, peak cheap oil is not about more recessions or price can never drop. It is about what happens after. It took until 2023 for the U.S. shale to recover to 2019 levels, i.e. a recession will give control of global oil markets to Russia and Saudi for 2 to 3 years equals oil prices much higher. I've heard him talk about this. Okay, now I could be wrong about peak cheap oil, but the idea that I understand from peak cheap oil is that the cost to get oil out of the ground, there is a minimum, and we have met that minimum. So prices can only go higher because the input costs for the price of gasoline or the price of oil per barrel are higher. And so the price of oil cannot drop past that. And oil continues to get cheaper. He needs, if it doesn't have to do with price, he should rename it something else. Here he says it has to do with price. So I don't know. I'm just reading these comments for the first time. I'll have to think about them a little bit more. And yet the increase in U.S. shale production, long laterals technology, could not drive U.S. shale back to the 10 to 25 price range oil traded in for 30 years in 73 through 2004. Why? Because peak cheap oil. Oh, gosh. This is not particularly controversial. All right. So this era was a oil glut, just like we're in right now. This era also never saw negative prices, and we saw negative prices recently. We could go back to this, let's say Saudi did put out they didn't do their production cuts, and we had an actual supply and demand with those 6 million more barrels per day. We probably would see price in this range, and we might see price return to this range. All right. Also, the 30 years ago, all right, we have had inflation in that period of time. We have had an increase in credit, and prices, general prices, will go up. But overall, no. I mean, if you adjust for inflation, the price of oil has not gone up. If you adjust for inflation, the price of oil actually is probably below where it was in some of these. If $25 per barrel in 1980, if you adjust for inflation, it's probably $75 to $100 a barrel, and we're under that. So no, this is kind of, it's a I don't know. It's not a complete understanding of the back and forth. And let's see, shale production, long laterals technology. Break evens, as far as I understand, are in the mid 40s, maybe a little bit higher, adjusted for inflation over the last couple of years. So maybe around $50 per barrel. But again, that's with not just the technology, that's also with the regulation. Biden has come in and put a lot of different regulations. He's cut down pipelines. He's increased or decreased the amount of land leases and stuff. You get rid of all of those different hurdles that add costs that artificially restrict supply, and we could easily see stuff around this level. So no, it's not because of peak cheap oil. It's because of regulation, inflation, that type of stuff. Has nothing to do with the fundamentals of the oil market, supply and demand. Okay, it has to do with all the externalities, all the different things that are affecting oil. So all right, that's my response to Luke Gromen. Let me go back to bitcoinandmarkets.com. And I'll just go to the main page and I'll take a look at your comments. 338 people watching. What's going on, guys? If you're watching over on Twitter, jump over to the YouTube and Rumble, like, comment, subscribe. I appreciate that. Help the show grow. Let me check Telegram for any comments. Looking. All right, that's it. This was supposed to be a short live stream, but it got longer as I started reading Luke Gromen's responses. I will be responding more to him in the future. He has a peak cheap oil, which is all about, oil prices going up in the future. And I have peak oil demand where demographics, technology like EVs and solar and wind, they will take marginal demand away, as well as ethanol and stuff like that. And we're at the end of a credit bubble. And as credit contracts in the world, we're going to have lower amounts of economic activity, lower ability to buy oil at any given price. So at any given price, the total demand at any given price will be lower in the future. That is peak oil demand. And peak cheap oil is, price of oil will go up. I remember interviewing him back, when was it? It was in March of 2022, I believe, right after the Russians invaded Ukraine and there was a spike in the oil price. I interviewed him right at that time. And I was like, hey, what if this is the top? Well, it just happened to be the next day was the top, or so, within a day or two of the interview. And he was like, no, it's going to 200. All of his arguments were about peak cheap oil and about the price going up because Russia, like he said in that tweet, Russia and all the pricing is going to be going overseas, and price just is going to continue to rocket higher. And no, nothing happened. We went down, and the economy could not support higher oil prices, because as your expenses go up, the rest of your economic activity has to go down, because oil is one of those things that you will choose to spend, or you have to spend. You can't. It's not disposable income. It's required spending. So if the price of oil goes up, more of your disposable income goes to the oil or the gas, and the rest of your economic activity goes down, which pulls down the rest of the economy. So you can have temporary blips of a little bit higher prices, but they will always lead to lower, because the economy cannot support those higher prices. All right, that's going to be it for today, guys. Thank you for joining me. BTCP says Gromen in denial. Yeah, okay, so I gave my spiel about Mallers and Schiff. Gromen, I think, is not a scammer. He's a legit guy that looks at the markets. I just think he doesn't understand oil. And if he doesn't understand oil and these arguments that I'm making, and been so wrong on like $200 a barrel oil and stuff like that, you have to start questioning his other things. But I do think that he is in good faith, unlike Peter Schiff, who I think is in bad faith. So hope this conversation can continue in the future and we can go back and forth and all that. So, all right, guys, thanks for joining me. Oh, tomorrow morning, 8:30 a.m. Eastern time is the CPI. I will be live streaming that. So if you want to join me, make sure you're subscribed to the YouTube and Rumble. Join us on Telegram, t.me/Bitcoin and markets. And that's going to be it, guys. Thanks. See you next time.